हेलो एंड वेलकम टू इंडिया रीड्स। मेरा नाम प्रदीप है और आपका स्वागत है मेरे चैनल इंडिया रीड्स में। आज हम शुरू करने वाले हैं एक नया बुक शांताराम बाय ग्रेगरी डेविड रॉबर्ट्स। मेरी कोशिश यही रहेगी कि मैं किताब को धीरे धीरे पढूं और जैसे हम वीडियो ख़त्म करेंगे मैं एक समरी दे दूंगा हिंदी में ताकि आप फॉलो कर सकें। लेट्स स्टार्ट विद चैप्टर 1। It took us a long time and most of the world to learn what I know about love and faith and the choices that we make. But the heart of it came to me in an instant while I was chained to a wall and being tortured. I realized somehow, through the screaming in my mind, that even in that shackled, bloody helplessness, I was still free, free to hate the men who were torturing me, or to forgive them. It doesn't sound like much, I know, but in that flinch and bite of the chain, when that's all you've got, that freedom, it's a universe of possibility. And the choice you make between hating and forgiving can become the story of your life. In my case, it's a long story and a crowded one. I was a revolutionary who lost his ideals in heroin, a philosopher who lost his integrity in crime, and a poet who lost his soul in a maximum security prison. When I escaped from that prison over the front wall between two gun towers, I became my country's most wanted man. Luck ran with me and flew with me across the world to India, where I joined the Bombay Mafia. I was a gun runner, a smuggler, a counterfeiter. I was chained on three continents, beaten, stabbed, and starved. I went to war. I ran into the enemy guns and I survived while other men around me died. They were better men than I am, most of them better men whose lives were crushed up in mistakes and thrown away by the wrong second of someone else's hate or love or indifference. And I buried them too, many of those good men, and grieved their stories and their lives into my own. But my story doesn't begin with them or with the mafia. It goes back to that first day in Bombay. Fate put me in the game there. Luck dealt the cards that led me to Carla Sarrain, and I started to play it out. That hand from that first moment, I looked into her green eyes. So it begins, the story, like everything else, with a woman, a city, and a little bit of luck. The first thing I noticed about Bombay on that first day was the smell of the different air. I could smell it before I heard or saw anything of India. Even as I walked along the umbilical corridor that connected to the plane to the airport, I was excited and delighted by it. In that first Bombay minute, escaped from prison and new into a wide new world, but I didn't and couldn't recognize it. I know now that it was the sweet, sweating smell of hope, which is the opposite of hate. And in that sore, stifled smell of greed, which is the opposite of love, it is a smell of gods, demons, corpses, and civilizations in resurrection and decay. It is the blue skin smell of sea, no matter where you are in the island, and blonde metal smell of machines. It smells of the air and sleep and waste of 60 million animals, more than half of them humans and rats. It smells of heartbreak and the struggle to live, and of the crucial failures and loves that produces our courage. It smells of 10,000 restaurants, 5,000 temples, shrines, churches, and mosques, and of 100 bazaars devoted exclusively to perfumes, spices, incense, and freshly cut flowers. Kalra once called it the ground worst good smell in the world. And she was right, of course. In that way, she had of being right about things. But whenever I return to Bombay now, it's my first sense of the city. That smell, above all things, that welcomes me and tells me that I've come home. The next thing I noticed was the heat. I stood in the airport queue, not 5 minutes from the air conditioning air of the plane, and my clothes clung to sudden sweat. My heart thumped under the command of the new climate. Every breath was an angry little victory. I came to know that it never stops. The jungle sweat, because the heat that makes it night and day in a wet heat. The choking humidity makes amphibians of us all in Bombay, breathing water in air, and you learn to live with it. And you learn to like it or you leave. Then there was the people, the Assamese, Jats, Punjabis, people from Rajasthan, Bengal, and Tamil Nadu, from Pushkar, Cochin, and Konark, warrior caste, Brahmins and untouchables, Hindus, Muslims, Christians, Buddhists, Parsis, Jains, animists, fair skin and dark, green eyes and golden, brown and black, every different face and form of that extravagant variety, that incomparable beauty, India. All the Bombay millions, and then there were more. The two best friends of the smuggler are the mule and the camel. Mules carry contraband across a border for a smuggler. Camels are unsuspecting tourists who help the smuggler to get across the border. To camouflage themselves when using false passports and identification papers, smugglers insinuate themselves into the company of fellow travelers, camels, who will carry themselves safely and unobtrusively through airports or border controls without realizing it. I didn't know all that then. I learned the smuggling arts much later, years later. On that first trip to India, I was just walking on instinct, and the only commodity I smuggling was myself, my fragile and hunted freedom. I was using a false New Zealand passport and my photograph substituted in it for the original. I'd done the work myself, and it wasn't a perfect job. I was sure that it would pass on a routine examination, but I knew if suspicions were aroused and someone checked with the New Zealand High Commission, it would be exposed as a forgery fairly quickly. On a journey to India from Auckland, I roamed the plain in search of a right group of New Zealanders. I found a small party of students who were making their second trip to the subcontinent. Urging them to share their experience and traveler's tips with me, I fostered a slender acquaintance with them that brought us to the airport controls together. The various Indian officials assumed that I was traveling with that relaxed and guileless group and gave me no more than a cursory glance. I pushed through along to the slap and sting of the sunlight outside the airport, intoxicated with the exhilarating of escaping another wall scaled, another border crossed, another day and night to run and hide. I'd escaped from prison almost 2 years before, but the fact of the fugitive life is that you have to keep on escaping every day and night. And while not completely free, never completely free, there was hope and fearful excitement in the new. A new passport, a new country, a new lines of excited dread on my young face. Under the grey eyes, I stood there on Trample Street, beneath the baked blue howl of Bombay sky, and my heart was as clean and hungry for promises as as a monsoon morning in the gardens of Malabar. Sir, sir, a voice called behind me. A hand grabbed my arm. I stopped. I trusted every, I tensed every fighting muscle and bit down on the fear. Don't run, don't panic, I told. A small man stood before me, dressed in a grimy brown uniform and carrying my guitar. More than small, he was a tiny man, a dwarf with a large head and a startled innocence of Down syndrome in his features. He thrust the guitar at me. Your music, sir, you're losing your music, isn't it? It was my guitar. I realized at once that I must have forgotten it in the baggage carousel. I couldn't guess that the little man had known it was. I couldn't guess how the little man had known it belonged to me. When I smiled my relief and surprise, the man grinned back at me with that perfect sincerity we fear and call simple minded. He passed the guitar on to me, and I noticed that his hands were webbed like the feet of a wading bird. I pulled out few notes from my pocket and offered to him. He backed away awkwardly on his thick legs. No money. We are here to help it, sir. Welcome to India, he said, and twisted away into the forest of bodies on the path. I bought a ticket to the city with the veterans bus service manned by ex servicemen from the Indian Army. I watched as my backpack and travel bag were lifted to the top of the bus and dumped into a pile of luggage with precise and nonchalant violence, and decided to keep the guitar in my hands. I took a place on the bench seat at the back of the bus and was joined by the two long-haired travelers. The bus quickly filled with a mix of Indians and foreigners, most of them young and traveling as inexpensively as possible. When the bus was close to a full, the driver turned in his seat, scowled at us menacingly, spat a jet of red vivid Beetlejuice through the open doorway and announced our imminent departure. ठीक है चलो. The engine roared, gears meshed with a growl and thunk, and we sped off at alarming speed through crowds of porters and pedestrians who limped, sprang, or sidestepped out of the way with only millimeters to spare. Our conductor, riding on the bottom step of the bus, cursed them with artful animosity. The journey from the airport to the city began on a wide, modern motorway lined with shrubs and trees. It was much like the neat, pragmatic landscape that surrounded the international airport in my home city, Melbourne. The familiarity hailed me into a complacency that was that was no profoundly shattered at the first narrowing of the road, that the contrast and its effect seemed calculated. For the first sight of the slums and as many lanes of the motorway became one, and the trees disappeared, clutched at my heart with talons of shame. Like brown and blue dunes, the acres of slum rolled away from the roadside and met the horizon with dirty heat haze mirages. The miserable shelters were patched together from rags, scraps of paper and plant, reed mats, and bamboo sticks. They slumped together, attached one to another, and with narrow lanes winding between them. Nothing in the enormous sprawl of it rose much above the height of a man. It seemed impossible that a modern airport full of prosperous and purposeful travelers was only kilometers away from those crushed and cindered dreams. My first impression was some catastrophe had taken place and the slums were refugee camps for the shambling survivors. I learned months later that they were survivors, of course, those slum dwellers. The catastrophe that had driven them to the slums from their villages was poverty, famine, and bloodshed. And 5,000 new survivors arrived in the city every week, week after week, year after year. As the kilometers wound past, as hundreds of people in those slums became thousands and tens of thousands, my spirit writhed. I felt defiled by my own health and the money in my pockets. If you feel it at all, it's a lacerating guilt. The first confrontation with the wretched of the earth. I dropped banks and dealt drugs, and I'd been beaten by prison guards till my bones broke. I'd been stabbed and I'd stabbed them in return. I'd escaped from a hard prison full of hard men the hard way over the front wall. Still that first encounter with the ragged misery of this slum heartbreak all the way to the horizon cut into my eyes. For that time I ran into the knives. For a time I ran into the knives. Then the smolders of slum and guilt flamed into anger, became a frightening rage at the unfairness of it. What kind of government, I thought, was the kind of what kind of system allows suffering like this? But the slums went on kilometer after kilometer, relieved only by the awful contrast of thriving business and crumbling, moss covered apartment buildings of comparatively affluent. The slums were and their sheer ambiguity were down my foreign foreigners' pieties. A land of wonder possessed me. A kind of wonder possessed me. I began to look beyond the immensity of the slum societies and to see people who lived within them. A woman stopped to brush for a black satin palm of her hair. Another bathed her children with water from a copper dish. A man led three goats with red ribbon tied to their collars around their throats. Another man showed himself at a cracked mirror. Children played everywhere. Men carried water in their buckets. Men made repairs on one of the huts, and everywhere that I looked, people smiled and laughed. A bus stopped in a stutter of traffic, and a man emerged from one of the huts near my window. He was a foreigner, a pale skin as any of the new arrivals on the bus, dressed only in a wrap around sheet of hibiscus patterned cotton. He stretched, yawned, and scratched himself consciously at his naked belly. There was a definite bovine placidity in his face and gesture. I found myself anew envying that contentment and the aimless and the smiles of greeting he drew from a group of people who walked past him up to the road. The bus jerked into motion once more and I lost sight of the man. But that image of him changed everything in my attitude about the slums. Seeing him there, a man as alien to the place as I was, let, let me picture myself in that world. What had seemed unimaginably strange and remote from my experience suddenly became possible and comprehensible, and finally fascinating. I looked at the people and then I saw how they were, how much industry and energy describe their lives. Occasional sudden glimpses inside the huts reveal the astonishing cleanliness of their poverty, the spotless floors and glistened metal pots in neat tapering towers. And then last, what should we what should have been first, I saw how beautiful they were. The women wrapped in crimson, blue, and gold, the women walling, walking barefooted through the tangled shabbiness of the slum with patient ethereal grace, the white-toothed, almond-eyed handsomeness of the men, and the affectionate camaraderie of the fine-limbed children, older ones playing with younger ones, many of them supporting baby brothers and sisters in their arms, in their slender arms. And half an hour after the bus began, I smiled for the first time. It ain't pretty, the young man beside me said, looking at the scene besides the window. He was a Canadian, a maple leaf patch on his jacket declared, and well set with plain eyes and shoulder length round hair. His companion looked like a shorter, more compact version of himself, and even wore identical stone washed pants, sandals, and soft calico jackets. Come again? This is your first time? He asked. I nodded. I thought so. Don't worry, from here on it gets a little better. Not so many slums and all, but it ain't good anywhere in Bombay. But this is the crummiest city in India, and you can take my word. You got that right, the shorter one agreed. But from here on in, you got a couple of nice temples and some big British buildings that are okay. Stone lions and brass steel lights and like that. But this ain't India. The real India's up the Himalayas, at Manali, or at the holy city of Varanasi, or down the coast in Kerala. You got to get out of the city and see the real India. Where are you guys headed? We are going to stay in an ashram, the friend announced. It's run by the Rajneeshis at Pune. It's the best ashram in the country. The pain of clear, pale blue eyes stared at me, and the vague, almost accusatory censure of those who convince themselves that we found our one true path. You checking in? Sorry? You checking into room, or you passing through Bombay today? I don't know, I replied, turning to look at the window once more. It was true, I didn't know whether I wanted to stay in Bombay or, for that matter, somewhere else. I don't know, and it didn't matter to me. Just at that moment, I was what Carla once called the most dangerous and fascinating animal in the world, a brave, hard man with a plan. I haven't got any plans, but I think I'll stay in Bombay for a while. Well, we are staying overnight and catching the train tomorrow. If you want, you can share the room. It's a lot cheaper that way. I met a stare in the guiltless blue eyes. Maybe it would be better if we see the room at first, I thought. Their genuine documents and easy smiles would smother my fake passport. Maybe it would be safer. And it's a lot safer, he added. Yeah, right, the friend agreed. Safe? I asked, assuming the nonchalance I didn't feel. The bus was moving more slowly amongst channels of three and four story buildings. Traffic churned through the streets with wondrous and mysterious efficacy. A ballistic dance of buses, trucks, bicycles, cars, ox carts, scooters, and people. The open windows of our battered have given us have given us the animas of spices, perfumes, diesel smoke, and the manure of oxen in a steamy but not unpleasant mix. The voices up everywhere amongst amongst ripples of unfamiliar music. Every corner carried gigantic posters advertising Indian films. The supernatural columns of the posters streamed besides the captured face of all the tall Canadian. इसके साथ हम ब्रेक लेंगे. मैंने कुछ 10 पेज ख़त्म कर लिए तो आज के लिए इतना ही है. अब तक हमने क्या देखा? हमने ये देखा कि एक हमारा कैरेक्टर है, हम इसका नाम नहीं जानते तो हम फ़िलहाल इसको शांताराम बुलाते हैं क्योंकि वही बुक का नाम है. तो ये जो बंदा है ये अपनी कहानी सुना रहा है और इस कहानी काफ़ी ड्रामे से भरी है. ये एक मुजरिम है जो ऑस्ट्रेलिया के सबसे बड़े प्रिजन से भागा हुआ है. ये एक नकली न्यूजीलैंड के पासपोर्ट से फ़्लाइट में मुंबई आता है और शायद ये अपनी कहानी का थोड़ा इंट्रोडक्शन देता है कि इसकी कहानी में काफ़ी सारा ड्रामा है, स्मगलिंग है, 3 अलग कॉन्टिनेंट की जेल उसने देखा है, वहाँ पे बहुत मार खाया है और कुछ डेजर्ट के बारे में बात करता है जहाँ पे ये एक वॉर में पार्ट इसने लिया, इसने स्मगलिंग किया है, इसने ड्रग्स की स्मगलिंग भी की है, आर्म्स की सप्लाई भी की है. तो कई सारी चीज़ें जो कहानी में आने वाली है उसका वो एक तरह का ट्रेलर दिखाते हैं अपने इंट्रोडक्शन से. और बात करते हैं मुंबई पे लैंड होने का एक्सपीरियंस. मुंबई में लैंड होते ही पहला उसका वरी है कि क्या वो पुलिस या कस्टम्स या वन ऑफ द चेक पॉइंट्स में फंस ना जाए. तो वो पहले ही वो प्लेन में न्यूजीलैंडर्स को ढूंढ के उनसे दोस्ती बना लेता है. तो जब बाहर निकलता है वो उनके साथ बाहर निकलता है, उनके साथ बात करते करते ताकि जो कस्टम्स चेक करने वाला है वो समझे कि ये उनकी ग्रुप का हिस्सा है और उन्हें बिना प्रॉब्लम के छोड़ दें. एयरपोर्ट से बाहर निकलते ही वो एक बस में चढ़ जाता है जहाँ से ये बस एक्स आर्मी मैन चला रहे हैं और ये शायद शहर ले जाए. और बस में पहले बॉम्बे के जो स्मेल को एक्सपीरियंस करता है, ये तब एक्सप्लेन नहीं कर पा रहा है कि स्मेल क्या है, बट जैसे जैसे वो कई सारे ट्रिप्स करता है बॉम्बे को और वो एक्सप्लेन कर पाता है कि ये एक मीठा इसको हम खुशबू कह लें, बदबू कह लें, बट बम्बई की एक स्मेल जिसमें पसीना भी है, जिसमें कचरा भी है, जिसमें एक वहाँ के मार्केट की स्पाइसेस भी हैं. ये एक मिक्स सा एक फ्रेग्रेंस है और ये फ्रेग्रेंस वो पहली बार एक्सपीरियंस करता है. और हर वक्त जब वो इंडिया आता है, खासकर बॉम्बे में लैंड होता है, तो वो फ्रेग्रेंस उसको वेलकम करती है. ये तो बॉम्बे का फर्स्ट एक्सपीरियंस है. जैसे वो प्लेन से उतर के एयरपोर्ट से आता है और एयरपोर्ट से बाहर निकलता है, बट बस में जब वो बैठा है और बस शुरू करता है तो उसका फर्स्ट एक्सपीरियंस ऑफ बॉम्बे वाज इन सीइंग द स्लम्स. और स्लम्स को देख के उसको थोड़ा शॉक होता है और फिर वो उस स्लम के लोगों को देखता है कि वो क्या कर रहे हैं, और बीच में अगर कोई दरवाज़ा खुला है तो देखता है कि अंदर सब कुछ साफ़ सुथरा है, बर्तन अच्छी तरह से रखे हैं। एक आदमी को देखता है जो अपने जिसने शर्ट भी नहीं पहना है और जो खुश है, लग रहा है कि वो उस जगह का राजा जैसा है, वो वहाँ खुश और संतुष्ट है। तो अपना कैरेक्टर सोचता है कि क्या मैं भी इस जगह में ऐसे कभी हो सकता हूँ क्या। और जैसे ही वो बस शुरू हो जाते हैं तो उसके पास जो बैठे लोग हैं उनसे बात उसकी शुरू हो जाती है। ये दो लोग कैनेडियन हैं और इनका प्लान है कि वो बॉम्बे में सिर्फ एक रात रहेंगे और फिर चले जाएंगे आगे। उनके मुताबिक बॉम्बे इंडिया की घटिया शहरों में से एक है, और रियल इंडिया जो है वो तो पहाड़ियों में है, मनाली में है। और बस वो उनका प्लान यही था कि वो एक रात वहाँ रह जाए और फिर वहाँ से निकल जाएंगे। तो बस वो यही ऑफ़र करते हैं। और जैसे ये हमारा कैरेक्टर कुछ कहना चाहता है या कहता है, ये बॉम्बे के एक्सप्लेनेशन के बीच वो कहता है, रेगिस्तान में ऊँट और बाकी जो खच्चर होते हैं उनके बारे में कहता है, वो स्मगलिंग के बारे में कहता है। और कोशिश ये है कि वो दो कहानियों को मर्ज कर सके, दो एक्सपीरियंसेस को मर्ज करके। एक तो है कि बॉम्बे में लैंड हो रहा है और उसकी जो एक्सपीरियंसेस है, वो उसने जो पहले जो देखा है वो क्या फील कर रहा है, क्या महसूस कर रहा है वो। और दूसरा जो उसका तजुर्बा है वो शायद किसी रेगिस्तान में स्मगलिंग या तस्करी या आर्म्स डीलिंग करते वक्त कैसे ऊँटों के थ्रू वो पुलिस या बॉर्डर या पेट्रोल से बचते थे, उसके बारे में कुछ हिंट देता है। काफ़ी डिटेल में यहाँ पे कुछ बताया नहीं है, बट ये पहला जो 10 पेज जो मैंने कंप्लीट किया है, ये बस वो एक फील नॉवल का लेकर आता है। इसके साथ हम ब्रेक लेंगे और आगे हम कंटिन्यू करेंगे अगले वीडियो में। तब तक आप अपने कमेंट्स, अपने सजेशंस यहाँ छोड़ सकते हैं। आपको ये रीडिंग कैसा लगा, और क्या आप चाहते हैं कि और एक्सप्लेनेशन हो, कोई भी सजेशन हो तो ज़रूर छोड़िए। लिंक बिलो है और कमेंट सेक्शन खुला है। टिल आई सी यू इन द नेक्स्ट वीडियो, टेक केयर, गुड बाय, गुड नाइट।